SOAR, adult socialization. You guys have your own assessment so that you are collecting the correct information for HAP. But when you are doing rapid rehousing and rental assistance, you will be using some of these. So when you get to that point, just make sure you are operating on assessments that use 2017 and York in parentheses at the end. Within the assessments, there's been a change to destination. When someone is exiting a program, they've made a couple of changes to the language in your options. Used to be that it said just permanent housing for formerly homeless persons, and there was no choice for if a person was leaving your program and they were entering a rental that was being subsidized by a rapid rehousing or rental assistance payment. So they've revised that now to say permanent housing other than RRH for formerly homeless persons, which would include your permanent supportive housing programs, as well as places like SROs, the YMCA, Dutch Kitchen. And then they've also added another option, which is rental by clients with RRH or equivalent subsidy. So if someone is in an emergency shelter and they leave the emergency shelter to move into a rental that is being assisted, their payments are being assisted by rapid rehousing or rental assistance, this will be the choice that you make. And those are your two new choices in the drop-down for destination. When you're in the entry assessment or you are in an update assessment, the non-cash benefits field has been updated a little bit. It used to say Section 8 public housing or rental assistance was an option, as well as temporary rental assistance. Those are old options and they have been removed for 2017. So that non-cash benefit list is just a little bit shorter this year. On the disabilities screen, I think everyone will be happy about this. They've taken out some of the confusing questions as well as the questions that are for path only. So this has helped immensely. They've removed whether or not the agency has documentation of a disability on file. They've removed both of the path questions, and they've removed the question about currently receiving services or treatment. So what used to be a very long screen that you used to bounce around a lot to answer the questions is much shorter now and much more direct. You do still have to say yes or no that they have a disability. You do still have to answer whether it's going to be long, continued, and indefinite and substantially impair their ability to live independently. And you do still have to answer whether or not the condition is going to be long-term. But this screen is much shorter and much less confusing for 2017. Now, all of those were changes that impact all programs regardless of their funding stream. Now we're going to talk a little bit about permanent housing changes. These are really more of a change in mentality than a change in data collection. So right now we have an entry date, and the training that has always been provided is that the entry date into your permanent housing program is the day that you accept them into your program. The residential move-in date has always been on the entry and update assessments, but has not been required to be answered, so you may not even be aware it was on there. And for 2017, they're changing the definition of your entry date, and they are requiring housing move-in dates. So both of those will need an answer moving forward. As of October 1st, the entry date is the date a person was admitted to your program. And of course, HUD has defined what admittance means. And admittance now means that information from the consumer or the referral source indicates that the person meets the criteria for admission into your program. The consumer has indicated that they want to be housed by your program, and the client will be able to access services and housing through the program in a reasonably short amount of time. That third one is really a safeguard from HUD around wait lists. For communities that have wait lists, they're basically telling you, that you shouldn't do an entry date, an admittance date on someone if you're just putting them on your wait list for housing. So that was just a safeguard. The first two mean that as long as the consumer is agreeable to your program and the consumer has self-reported or the referral source has reported that a person appears to be eligible for your program, you should put an entry date in and you should start that process in HMIS. So it's a little different, it's a little earlier than it used to be. Housing move-in date is the date the person actually moved into housing in your program. So almost always your entry date will be well before your housing move-in date. The important part about admittance is that admittance is not the date that you finally have collected all of the necessary information you need. So this is not, your entry date is no longer the day that you have a completed intake and you have all of the homeless verifications and you have income verifications. It's none of that. It's when you first decide that you're going to move forward with collecting all that information from the client. So that's the big change here. It's a much earlier date. The reason that HUD is doing this is they want to see from the time a person expresses interest in a program or is referred to a program, how long does it take to actually get them into housing? It's important to note that it is information from the consumer or referral source. It does not have to be documentation from the consumer or referral source. It can just be a verbal confirmation. So my example is if a program requires a chronic homeless status to enter the program, and a consumer has approached that program staff and said they're interested in the program and they have a disability and that they've been homeless for quite some time, that is enough to start the process for entry. And that date that they start that is their new admittance or entry date. So as a review, your entry date, the language is still the same on HMIS. It's still called an entry date. For emergency shelters, transitional housing, and for those two programs, it will be the date the person moves in. There's no change there. It has always been that. For the case management program, it'll continue to be the date you first started working with that person. For permanent housing and permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing, this will be your admittance date, that date that you first acknowledged you were going to start the intake process with a person. The housing move-in date is where residential move-in date used to be. It's at the very bottom of your entry and update assessments. Emergency shelter, transitional housing, and case management do not have to fill that in, but permanent housing, permanent supportive housing, and rapid rehousing do. Since your entry date and your housing move-in date are probably going to be separated, there's an update on how you should enter housing move-in date. So housing move-in date shows up on your entry assessment, but unless the person coming into your program has been referred, completed intake with all of their paperwork documented and provided, and moved into housing on the same day, those dates are not going to be the same. So I am encouraging everyone to leave housing move-in date blank on your entry assessment and instead do an update assessment through the interims button on the entry exit tab to reflect the appropriate date that that person was housed. So if their admittance date, if the day that it first appeared you were going to start working to intake this person is September 1st of 2017, and their housing move-in date is the 20th of September 2017, your entry date, of course, will be September 1st. And then on the 20th or around the 20th, when you update your HMIS information, you'll go in and you'll create an update under interims. You'll type in the 20th of September as the date of your update. You will save and continue that screen. It'll let you access the update assessment. And at the bottom of the update assessment, you'll type the housing move-in date, which is 9/20/2017, and you'll save and exit. So what that looks like in HMIS is you will find your program. I used York apartments with bell socialization is my example here. You'll find your program. You'll go all the way across on the entry exit tab until you see the interims button. The button's actually supposed to be a piece of paper with check boxes on it, but it's hard to see. You'll click that button and it will provide a pop-up that says add interim review. The interim review screen will ask you to choose an interim review type, and there is a drop down here. There's a 30-day review, a 60-day, a 90-day, a 120-day, an annual assessment, and an update. So when you're putting the housing move-in date in, you will choose update. You'll type in the date that person moved into housing. You'll save and continue, and it will take you into the assessment. It will default you to the HUD COC and ESG update assessment. So that's where you need to be. You'll scroll down to the bottom of that assessment and you will type the date they moved into housing under housing move-in date, and you will save and exit. And you are done entering the housing move-in date. So with this change, of course, that begs the question, what happens if I start admitting a person into my program and they have an entry date and they have a record in HMIS, but they never reach housing? So if they don't reach housing, you will do your admittance date just as you normally would. You will fill in the entry assessment information that you have. But if something prevents them from moving in, I will ask you to do an update through the interim button. You will leave the move-in date blank, and there will be a question under the move-in date that says reason housing move-in date is blank. And I'll ask you to pull from that drop-down and explain why housing wasn't achieved for the client. Now, that field is one that HUD wanted to include in the data standards across all communities, but they didn't get the question written in time. So instead, they're encouraging communities for this year to create their own question and at least track it locally to find out why housing isn't being achieved for some people. So I have gone ahead and created that question, and I created a drop-down, but I do need help from those that provide housing with reasons that housing would not be achieved. I have a couple in there now, but anything that comes to you, please go back and let me know about it. Once you've done an update to show me why the housing move-in date was blank and housing was not achieved, I just ask you to exit the client as you normally would. So this is the reason housing move-in date is blank drop-down. So when I took my screenshot, I had just a couple of basic options there. The client didn't locate housing by the deadline. The client wasn't eligible for the program. That may have happened after the initial verbal information the client provided you. The client was a no-show. They stopped coming to see you before they were housed, and data not collected. Since then, I've also added some language around institutions, things like the client went to jail or prison, went to a psychiatric facility, went to a medical facility that was not psychiatric, went to a long-term care home, went to a substance abuse or detox center. So those are on there as well. But if you encounter things that you need there, don't hesitate to reach out. I will add them to the list. We want to make sure it's comprehensive for our uses. Those are the changes. That's it. I don't know if you have any questions. Taking that as a no. Well, since I record these, I will send out the links afterwards. If you have questions as you begin to use the new standards, don't hesitate to reach out. I will be happy to help. Thanks for attending. Have a good afternoon.